To give a lecture on this subject in Nuremberg compels one to address a well-known event that took place in this city. There have been two major films on the subject of the Nuremberg Trials. One was filmed in 1961 with the famous American actor Spencer Tracy, and it somewhat fictionalized the trial. The most astonishing performance was given by the German actor Maximilian Schell, who had the difficult assignment of representing the Nazi defendants. In fact, it was fictionalized. He was defending judges when, as you might know, no German judge was ever held accountable for their actions during the Hitler regime. There's been a more recent film produced also on the Nuremberg Trials that has just come out during the past year. The original trial, 1945 to 46, was a critical event in the political history of the 20th century. It was initially convened on November 20th, 1945, and the first trial was concluded in October 1946. 22 defendants sat in the dock. Among those were leading survivors in the leadership of the Nazi regime. The charges against them were organized under 4 counts: conspiracy to wage aggressive war, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Of these, it was the charge of crimes against peace, the planning, preparation, initiation, and waging of wars of aggression that the tribunal designated as the supreme crime. It's important to understand that. Generally speaking, when one asks people, and I've given many lectures on the subject, when one asks students, what was the crime for which the Nazi leaders were convicted? And the general answer is the Holocaust. And I say, no, that was not the main charge. That was one of the charges, crimes against humanity, but the main charge was crimes against peace. As I said, the supreme crime. Of the 13 defendants who were found guilty of waging wars of aggression, 11 of the defendants, including von Ribbentrop, Keitel, Jodl, Streicher, Goering escaped death by committing suicide. Hess was sentenced to life imprisonment. Kaltenbrunner was hanged. Sauckel was hanged. Frank was hanged. The most important charge was crimes against peace, that these individuals had actually planned and prepared a war without justification. The chief American prosecutor, Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, opened the proceedings with words that remain the most authoritative statement of the principles upon which the trials were organized. And he said, I quote, "The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated." Jackson stated explicitly that the law could not be applied selectively. You couldn't pick and choose against which countries and which defendants you held responsible for the violation of this law. It could not be a law for the defeated alone. It could not be an example of victor's justice, which, by the way, is what the Nazis claimed it was. They were being held to a standard set by those who had won the war, but they themselves didn't intend to follow it. Jackson said, and I quote again, "While this law is first applied against German aggressors, the law includes, and if it is to serve a useful purpose, it must condemn aggression by any other nations, including those which sit here now in justice and judgment." And he made a statement of principle so sweeping, so uncompromising, that it indicts the entire subsequent history of American foreign policy, and above all, the actions which are now being taken by the Trump administration. He said, "Any resort to war, to any kind of a war, is a resort to means that are inherently criminal. An honestly defensive war is, of course, legal. But inherently criminal acts cannot be defended by showing that those who committed them were engaged in a war when war itself is illegal." The tribunal's verdict gave this principle the force of law. The verdict defined a war of aggression as, quote, "the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole." That formulation, "contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole," is of the most profound significance. It means that every atrocity committed in the course of an aggressive war, every civilian killed, every building destroyed, every act of torture and collective punishment flows from and is contained within the original criminal decision to launch the war. The initiators of aggressive war bear responsibility not only for the act of aggression itself, but for everything that follows from it. Now, the tribunal established a principle of individual criminal responsibility that extended far beyond the heads of state who ordered the aggressive war. The principle reaches everyone who participated in the planning, preparation, initiation, or waging of a war of aggression. This was applied not only to military commanders. There were further trials at Nuremberg that extended the principle systematically. The so-called Ministries Trial, known as United States versus von Weizsäcker, convicted senior officials of the German Foreign Ministry, the Finance Ministry, and the Reichschancellery for their roles in facilitating aggressive war, even where they had not personally ordered military operations. The High Command trial established that military officers who transmitted or implemented orders for aggressive war bore individual responsibility, regardless of the chain of command. The industrialist trial of Krupp, Flick, and the executives of IG Farben established that private corporate actors who profited from and facilitated aggressive war were criminally liable. Well, of course, as you know, many of these individuals who were tried were later released from prison and much of their fortunes were restored. But there was a matter of principle that transcends the trials themselves. Also, the case against Hans Fritzsche, the head of the German press division, established a further principle of direct relevance to our present moment. The prosecution argued that Fritzsche and the propaganda apparatus of the Nazi state bore responsibility for preparing the German public psychologically for wars of aggression. Quote, before each major aggression, they initiated a press campaign calculated to weaken their victims and to prepare the German people psychologically for the attack. The use of propaganda to manufacture consent for aggressive war was treated not as a peripheral matter, but as an integral component of the criminal enterprise. The defenses ordered by the accused were systematically rejected. The most famous, that they were following orders, that they were merely carrying out the policies of their government, that was rejected. Or that the decision to go to war represented a consensus of responsible opinion, and that the war's illegality was unclear or debatable. The prosecution insisted that individuals have a duty to refuse to participate in aggressive war, regardless of what their government demands of them. Jackson concluded his opening statement with a warning that was intended to echo across generations. He said, "Let me make clear that while this law is first applied against German aggressors, the law includes, and if it is to serve a useful purpose, it must condemn aggression by any other nations, including those which sit here now in judgment." In other words, the same standard would have to be applied against American politicians if they were to commit the same crime that the Nazi leaders had. And of course, if the standards established at Nuremberg are applied, then the war against Iran is without any question a crime against peace, and all those who are waging it are criminals. This is not an exaggeration, it is a legal fact. Trump is a criminal. Hegseth is a criminal. Rubio is a criminal. The generals, the military people are criminal. And the propagandists who are promoting it, whether they write for the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Frankfurter Allgemeine, Berliner Tageblatt, all of them, if one were to apply the standards of Nuremberg, are criminals. That's not the opinion of the Trotskyist movement. That is the opinion established by bourgeois legal representatives 80 years ago. Now, on February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel, without even a formal declaration of war, launched a massive attack on Iran, striking military bases, government facilities, and cities across the country. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed in the initial assault, along with numerous other officials and an unknown number of civilians. Schools, hospitals, and cultural heritage sites were damaged or destroyed. The cultural and heritage sites of a country with a civilization that extends thousands of years. Within days, the United States had dropped 5,000-pound bunker buster bombs on Iranian missile sites along the Strait of Hormuz. A U.S. submarine torpedoed and sank an Iranian frigate in the Indian Ocean. A vessel the Pentagon knew to be unarmed as it was returning from a multinational naval exercise that required participating ships to carry no ammunition. 80 crew members were killed. It was the first ship sunk by an American submarine since World War II. And this attack was launched on the very night that Omani mediators reported major progress in nuclear negotiations and that Iran had agreed in principle to zero out its enriched uranium stockpile. Iran's foreign minister had publicly stated that a historic agreement to avert war was within reach. But the Arms Control Association has concluded that by the time of the Geneva session, Trump had likely already decided to go to war, and that nothing short of a complete Iranian capitulation would have averted the strikes. The United States chose war, an aggressive war, over a negotiated settlement. It was launched without provocation. It was launched without authorization from the United Nations Security Council. It was launched without a declaration of war by the United States Congress. It was launched in violation of the United Nations Charter, which prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity of any state. But who cares? Iran had not attacked the United States. It posed no imminent threat to the United States. America's own intelligence assessments have concluded that Iran's so-called alleged long-range ballistic missile threat to the United States is unfounded. Another example of weapons of mass destruction. All a lie. Now, as of this lecture, the war has been underway for nearly 4 weeks. At least 1,900 people have been killed in Iran, probably far more. And 13 American military personnel have died, and there's probably more dead than that. The government's not telling anybody what the real figures are. In Iran, over 4,000 civilian buildings have been damaged, and in self-defense, Iran has responded with missile and drone strikes across the Gulf region, hitting targets in Israel, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 1/5 of the world's oil ordinarily flows, has been effectively closed. Oil prices have surged past $100 a barrel, and the International Energy Agency has described the situation as worse than both the energy crises of the 1970s and the fallout of the Ukraine war combined. President Trump has demanded Iran's unconditional surrender. He has threatened to strike Iran's nuclear plants and power grid, and he has declared that regime change will happen. Hegseth has said the military will not relent until, quote, the enemy is totally and decisively defeated. Trump, in his address to the nation on February 28th, you might have seen it, he appeared with a baseball cap on his head in the middle of the night. Not a speech from the Oval Office, not an explanation to the American people in an announced address as to why the United States was going to war, just appearing with complete contempt and announcing that the United States would destroy Iranian missiles and raze their missile industry to the ground. And he warned, quote, the Iranians will soon learn that no one should challenge the strength and might of the United States armed forces. Now, the language employed by the President of the United States is extraordinary. He speaks like a mafia gangster. I don't know whether they've shown the series The Sopranos on television here in Germany, or whether you've seen films by Martin Scorsese, like Casino and other films about the mafia. But when you look at Trump, that's what you're looking at. He is a gangster. He's a criminal. That's his life. He said in relationship to Iran, quote, on March 9th, they will be hit by the United States 20 times harder than they have been hit thus far. On March 22nd, he threatened, quote, to hit and obliterate their various power plants, starting with the biggest one first. By the way, that's all illegal. To hit power plants is illegal. His press secretary announced that, quote, President Trump does not bluff, and he is prepared to unleash hell. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, an accused war criminal who successfully lobbied during Trump's first term for the pardons of soldiers convicted of war crimes, and who, upon taking office, fired the judge advocates general of multiple military branches and dismantled the Pentagon's civilian casualty tracking mechanisms, has matched this rhetoric with language that explicitly repudiates the laws of war. At his first Pentagon briefing on the war on March 2nd, Hegseth boasted of, quote, unleashing the most lethal and precise air power campaign in history, unbound, quote, by stupid laws of engagement, undeterred by, quote, what so-called international institutions say, unquote, and free of, quote, no nation-building quagmire, no democracy-building exercises, no politically correct wars. In an address to generals, he declared, quote, we untie the hands of our war fighters to intimidate, demoralize, hunt, and kill the enemies of our country. He told troops to be focused, disciplined, lethal, and unbreakable. We are not defenders anymore. We are warriors, trained to kill the enemy and break their will. I think here in Germany, you know what this language is. It's the language of Vernichtungskrieg. It's the language which Hitler employed against the Soviet Union, of the secret orders given by Himmler to the SS. No mercy, murder, kill, execute. This from leaders of a supposedly democratic country, not just any democratic country, the country that claims to be the leader of the free world. That was not all. He said on March 4th, death and destruction from the sky all day long. We're playing for keeps. On March 14th, he promised, quote, no quarter, no mercy for our enemies. Language that has constituted a violation of international law since the Hague Convention of 1899. No quarter. That's a very precise term. According to the laws of war, the moment a soldier puts up his hands and surrenders, he cannot be killed. He becomes a prisoner of war. He's out of the fight, and he's entitled to certain legal protection. And if he is shot, those who have shot him have now committed murder. Now we know in war that takes place. But this is not the action of soldiers caught up in the violence of the moment. These are orders being given by the Secretary of Defense of the United States. If he were to be put on trial, every one of these words would be introduced as evidence. I won't speak of the punishment he deserves, but you can draw your own conclusions. Now, where are we now? The war has gone on for almost a month. The war is entering a new and far more dangerous phase. Everything now points toward a significant escalation, one that the Trump administration is actively preparing, even as it maintains the fiction of negotiations with Iran. On Saturday, March 22nd, Trump issued a 48-hour ultimatum to Iran. Reopen the Strait of Hormuz or he would obliterate Iran's power plants. When that deadline expired, Trump announced a 5-day pause, citing, quote, good and productive conversations with Tehran. Just yesterday, he extended the pause by 10 more days to April 6th, claiming the extension was granted at Iran's request. foreign minister said of Iran, so that's a lie. Now, Trump has claimed repeatedly and insistently that the United States is engaged in productive negotiations with Iran. Productive negotiations. His Secretary of War, or Defense, Hegseth, says the United States negotiates with bombs. Those were the words he used. And then Trump said, the Iranians, quote, want to make a deal so badly, but they're afraid to say it because they figure they'll be killed by their own people. They're also afraid that they'll be killed by us. Now, everything that Trump is saying is a fabrication. They constitute war propaganda in the most precise and classical sense of the term, a deliberate effort to mislead the public about the trajectory of the conflict in order to provide a political cover for what is being prepared. And it is worth noting that the manufacture of false diplomatic pretexts to conceal the preparation of military aggression is also precisely the conduct for which the Nuremberg defendants were convicted. There are no direct talks underway between the United States and Iran. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has stated this unequivocally. He said, no negotiations have happened with the enemy until now, and we do not plan any negotiations. He has clarified that the exchange of messages through mediating countries, quote, does not constitute negotiation or dialogue. It is an exchange of messages. He went on to say that the United States, if it is negotiating at all, is negotiating with itself. Now, Trump has not identified the American negotiators in any specific way. He has not identified the so-called Iranian representatives. He has refused to name the Iranian official that he claims to be dealing with. In fact, if there were Iranian officials seeking to negotiate with the U.S. government, the greatest threat to their lives would be from the United States government and its Israeli attack dogs, which habitually assassinate Iranian negotiators. Not a word coming out of Washington is to be believed. There are no scheduled meetings between American and Iranian negotiators. What exists is a 15-point ultimatum transmitted through Pakistani intermediaries, which Iran has rejected. Iran has responded with 5 conditions of its own, including a complete cessation of hostilities, guarantees against future attacks, compensation for war damages, and recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, conditions that are fundamentally incompatible with American demands. What, in fact, is being called negotiations is, in reality, fraudulent pauses dressed up as diplomatic activity while the military prepares for the next stage of operations. The United States talks about negotiations, but the Trump administration is conducting the largest deployment of ground forces to the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Approximately 8,000 U.S. ground troops have been deployed to the region in the past week alone. These include 2,200 Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit aboard the USS Tripoli, some 2,500 Marines from the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit, the Pride of the Pacific, aboard the USS Boxer, and more than 1,000 soldiers from the Army's 82nd Airborne Division, the military's Rapid Response Force. Additional warships are en route. The United States has already 50,000 military personnel in the region. These are not defensive deployments. Marine expeditionary units are amphibious assault forces designed for offensive operations, raids, seizures of territory, and short-duration missions. The 82nd Airborne, as I said, is an immediate reaction force. The composition of these forces being deployed tells you what they are for. Now again, all of this is being done without any congressional authorization. And so I think we can draw certain conclusions. Every pause announced by Trump simply coincides with the arrival of additional forces. The rhetoric of negotiation serves as cover for the preparation of a major escalation. The Nuremberg indictment asserted that the destruction of civilian infrastructure, when it serves no legitimate military purposes, constitutes a war crime. Now, again, the destruction of a nation's electrical grid would affect hospitals, water treatment systems, food refrigeration, communications, and every aspect of civilian life. For a country of 91 million people, the consequences would be catastrophic, a humanitarian disaster on a massive scale. Now, again, this is a form of warfare that the Nuremberg Principles and the Geneva Convention were specifically designed to prohibit. Now, the European imperialist powers, including the German government, are entirely complicit in this crime. Their differences with Washington, to the extent that they exist, are of a purely technical character. The European Union issued a statement on March 1st that did not condemn the U.S.-Israeli surprise attack, but instead denounced Iran's retaliatory strikes as inexcusable. It's an amazing approach to reality. The United States can launch a war whenever it pleases with the support of the European powers, but if Iran defends itself, it's inexcusable. France, Merz has described Iran as a major security threat. France deployed its aircraft carrier to the region. The EU's foreign policy chief has described the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine as very much interlinked, framing the criminal aggression against Iran as a component of the broader confrontation with Russia. Now, for 4 years, the same European governments that are supporting the United States have denounced what they call Russia's unprovoked war against Ukraine. Now, in our view, Putin's decision to go to war against Ukraine was entirely reactionary. But it was not unprovoked. It was instigated by NATO's relentless eastward expansion. However, putting aside a discussion of the causes of the war, the fact is that in their denunciations of Putin, the governments of Germany, France, Britain, and other European NATO members have invoked international law, the sanctity of sovereignty, and the inviolability of borders. They have imposed sweeping sanctions on Russia. Yet confronted with an indisputably unprovoked war by their principal ally against a nation of 91 million people, they have not uttered a single word of opposition. The so-called rules-based international order has been exposed once again as a euphemism for the right of the imperialist powers to make war on whomever they choose. The war against Iran cannot be understood as an aberration, as the product of one man's recklessness or one administration's criminality, however extreme. The nature of and circumstances of this war, its total illegality, the brazenness with which it has been launched, the stupidity, venality, and criminality of the president who ordered it, the psychopathic character of the defense secretary who is directing it, are the product of a terminally diseased social and political order. A country that allows itself to be carried into war in such a manner, by such people, under such circumstances, is a country in profound crisis. The military disaster that follows, and it will follow, and all the signs indicate that this coming attack has been launched is being launched and prepared with utter recklessness, is a product of a more fundamental crisis. The entire political establishment of the United States and its institutions are implicated in this war. We don't have a bad Trump theory of history. Trotsky said very famously on the eve of World War II that there are those who would like to suggest that if it wasn't for Hitler, Europe would bloom like a garden. Hitler was a product of the breakdown of the capitalist system that had started 25 years earlier with the beginning of World War I. The question you have to ask yourself as you observe events which seem so extraordinary, and I'm sure you use the word insane, crazy, I don't understand it. Because everyone has to ask themselves, all right, let us say that Trump is, as I say he is a criminal. He's a gangster. He comes out of the casino industry, out of entertainment television. He is a manifestation of the most filthy elements of American capitalist society. But then, how is it possible that political power has been placed in the hands of such a person? This is a man who has now dominated American political life for 10 years. Now, it took Hitler, even in the fragile Weimar Republic, 10 years to go from the 1923 coup in Munich to becoming chancellor in 1933. In January 2021, Trump attempted to overthrow the U.S. government. He was never held responsible for it. Weimar hung on for 10 years after Hitler's attempted putsch in 1923. Trump was back in power within 4. And he entered office as the first convicted criminal felon. And somehow all of this has been normalized. Well, it is obvious that such a situation cannot be explained on any other basis but that it represents a profound sickness in American society, and even more fundamentally, given the place of America in world politics, in the whole global capitalist order. In other words, we can't explain the crisis from Trump. We have to explain Trump from the crisis. What has led the United States to engage in such a reckless course of action with potentially catastrophic consequences? Now, we have been warning now for some 35 years, that the United States saw in the dissolution of the Soviet Union an opportunity to recreate the world as it would have been had there been no Russian Revolution, had there been no organized struggles against the working class, by the working class. A whole series of wars were initiated in 1991. But it was not just driven by malignant intentions. If you examine the state of American capitalism, what you see in objective terms is an economic order in the most extreme crisis. The present national debt of the United States is $38 trillion. The social structure of the country is entirely oligarchic. If we would assemble in this room, and we probably could fit most of them, the billionaires in America, you would have a section of the population that has more wealth than the bottom 50% of the country. The United States of 1945-46, at the time of the Nuremberg Trials, when it was articulating all of these very elegant democratic principles, was a country that dominated the world economy with its productive strength. Today it is a country massively indebted, which understands that it can restore its dominant position only through military violence. Its industries are in decay. Its manufacturing capacity is in decay. It's facing huge challenge from global competitors, particularly China. It desperately requires access to strategic resources upon which much of the most critical modern industries depend. And this cannot be obtained any other way except through violence. In other words, that is the rational content behind the irrational policies. And it can't be altered, therefore, by appeals for something better. I mean, one has to explain not only Trump, but all the political institutions, the Supreme Court, the Congress. And finally, and this applies just as much to Germany, because we see here analogous processes. I'm sure Comrade Christoph can speak at this in much greater length and in greater detail, but from what I have observed of German politics, if I may use another, there's a great deal of déjà vu. Once again, they're talking here about transforming Germany into a great military power. Similar language as that of Hegseth is being used. We must once again have a warrior culture. Germans have to get used to fighting wars, as if you didn't have enough of them. And who is the great enemy? Russia. Let's have a third attempt at a war with Russia. Now again, I want to make very clear, because it's often confusion, we're the Trotskyist movement. We waged an unrelenting fight against Stalinism, against the betrayal of the October Revolution, and we are unalterably hostile to the politics of Putin and the bureaucracy which turned into the oligarchy. But it is important to understand that what is driving German foreign policy is nothing more than the old demands. Where is Germany to expand? How will it deal with its own internal crisis? The resources of Russia beckon. Ukraine was just an instrument of this. After all, if I have my history correct, Germany invaded Ukraine twice in the 20th century, and in the most brutal ways. So this is a broader tendency which we see internationally. And the great problem is that the one force that can stop this, the one social force which has the capacity to oppose imperialism, is strangled by the organizations which dominate it. The trade union bureaucracies, the social democrats who have absolutely nothing to do with socialism any longer, the left party which supports every military operation. And so when we look at this world situation, and the United States is only the most extreme expression, it poses very sharply what Trotsky referred to on the eve of World War II as the crisis of leadership. He said at that time, in 1938, in the founding document, he described the epoch as that of the death agony of capitalism. By that point, it was clear that a war was inevitable. And he posed then the danger that without a social revolution, a catastrophe threatened the entire culture of mankind. And he was correct. What was World War II but a catastrophe? 70 or 80 million people killed throughout the world, 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japan, 6 million Jews murdered in Europe. barbarism on a scale that had never been seen, only 25 years after the First World War. And if the planet survived, it was because at that time, the weaponry did not exist until the very last stages of the war to blow up the planet. And then they only existed in elementary form. And there was a working class which, despite all the defeats, was still able to summon the strength, particularly in the Soviet Union, to defeat Hitler. Now we live in a world where the implications of war are even more extreme. As you know, if you've been following events, the use of nuclear weapons is being normalized. No one knows what the Israelis will do from one day to the next. They will stop at nothing. And the United States is led by people who are normalizing war. And throughout the discussion throughout the last 4 years, in the conflict with Russia over Ukraine, the possibility of nuclear weapons has been continuously raised. And the response of European politicians has been to say, we're not scared of that. Well, those who say they're not scared of the use of nuclear weapons are out of their minds. Or they reflect a political system that has become totally irrational. Now, these are the dangers. What are the countervailing factors? Is there a possibility of stopping this? Well, in conclusion, I just would like to reference those forces which are working in another direction. Today, the working class is incomparably more powerful than it was 80, 90, 100 years ago. In just the last 40 years, we have seen a massive industrialization of the world, and we have seen the emergence of massive working classes in areas of the world where there was barely a proletariat 50 years ago. Within the next 10 years, the largest cities in the world will be in Africa. The proletariat, to use the old Marxist expression, now is by far a massive global force. And moreover, this global force is objectively interconnected by the very development of the world economy. We live in a world of global production networks, instantaneous communications. The coordination of action on a world scale is not a utopia, it is a reality. The question is whether these advances can be utilized and become a mechanism for the organization of global struggle. And this is a final point. Look, the fight against war is not simply a national question. If we could stop war simply in America, I wouldn't even have to come here. But today, the fight against war must be waged on an international scale. And here, the great heritage of the Trotskyist movement, and in fact, the great heritage of the socialist movement and its finest representatives in Germany and in Europe, emerges again. The fundamental question is the following: will it be possible to construct an international movement based on the working class to revive the powerful traditions of socialism, the enormous power of Marxism as a method of analysis, to provide the necessary strategic leadership to the working class? Now, there will be struggles. I've been active in revolutionary politics for over a half century, and have had no small amount of experience in the class struggle in the United States. The American working class is a powerful force, but it operates within the most politically reactionary environment. And much of its thinking has been informed by the wealth of the past, the land of unlimited opportunity. And it was frankly unprepared for the offensive launched against it after Reagan came to power, particularly some 45 years ago. But there is a change. During the last 2 years, 3 years, and even now, we see an escalation of class conflict. The working class is being radicalized. And I think this is the case internationally. Again, in America, you see in the most extreme form the reactionary tendencies of capitalist social development. But here in Germany, in France, throughout Europe, internationally, there is a growth of working class radicalism. But that radicalism requires political direction. And I'll make one further point. Iran was itself the center of an enormous revolution in 1979. But that revolution was frustrated and misled along national lines. It came under the leadership of the Islamic elements. And that wasn't an accident. It was, to use a political term, betrayed by its Stalinist leadership. On an even more fundamental level, that's been the history of the German workers' movement. The betrayal of 1914, the betrayal of the post-war revolutionary, the betrayal of 1933, when the two largest working class parties in the world, the Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party, allowed Hitler to come to power. Now, all of these political lessons form the basis of our movement. The fundamental question today is a question of the development of revolutionary leadership on the basis of an international socialist strategy. Now, if I've spoken sharply today, it's because in the final analysis, the situation which is unfolding requires everyone who recognizes and senses the gravity of the situation to make political decisions. As I said the other day in Berlin, I'm often asked, what are you going to do? What is your party going to do? And my answer to that, we have a policy. We put out the World Socialist Web Site. We fight for our policies. We explain the crisis. We have an extraordinary record of political accuracy. But the question is, what are you going to do? What will be the decision made by workers, by youth, by intellectuals? And we're not asking individuals to go out and fight wildly. No. Turn your attention to the fight to build political leadership in the working class. Build a political party. One that is based and exemplifies the powerful historical traditions of Marxism. And that is really for us today a life and death question. Sie müssen sich entscheiden. That's the situation. Entweder oder. Trotz alledem und alledem. Yes, there are many problems. So many people say to me, I'm ready to fight, but nobody else. I said, if everybody who tells me they were the only ones who could fight, my God, we'd have a mass party. Yeah. But I think we're at the point where people are coming to that decision. They realize, jetzt ist es Leben und Tod. Und das ist wirklich wahr.
Sozialismus oder Barbarei.
Genau. Aber diesmal muss der Sozialismus siegen, nicht die Barbarei. Und das ist wirklich möglich. Danke für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit.